When Eloise Whitaker told her 3 grown children she had bought 40 acres of swampland in rural Iowa for $185 at a county auction, they thought she had lost her mind. Her daughter called it dementia buying. Her youngest son laughed and said, "Mom, you bought a mosquito farm." Eloise didn't explain herself. She didn't need to because Eloise had worked for the county surveyor's office for 35 years, and she knew something about that land that nobody else alive remembered. 3 weeks before that phone call, Eloise Whitaker had been sitting in the back row of the Lynn County Courthouse in a folding chair that wobbled every time she shifted her weight. The room smelled like floor wax and old radiators. About 40 people were scattered across the rows, mostly farmers and a few out-of-town investors with clipboards, all waiting for the annual tax-delinquent land auction to begin. The auctioneer was a man named Gil Swanson, who had been running these sales for as long as Eloise could remember. She had known him back when she was 19 years old and just starting at the surveyor's office, back when being the only woman in that office meant bringing coffee to men who called her sweetheart and assumed she couldn't read a contour map. Gil rattled through the first dozen parcels fast. A half-acre lot behind the gas station, 3 residential lots on the edge of town, a bankrupt grain operation north of the highway. Bidders raised their hands. Numbers went up. Gavels came down. Then Gil got to parcel number 17, 40 acres, Section 12, Township 84 North. Gil read from his sheet. Property is classified wetland, mostly standing water delinquent on taxes since 2014. Starting bid is $185. Nobody moved. Gil looked up from his paper. $185 for 40 acres. Do I have a bid? Silence. A man in the second row turned to his neighbor and whispered something. The neighbor shook his head. "Folks, that's less than $5 an acre," Gil said. "Anybody?" Eloise raised her hand. Gil looked surprised. "I have 185 from the lady in the back." "Do I hear 200? Nobody spoke. "Sold," Gil said. $185 to Eloise Whitaker. A few heads turned. Eloise nodded once and wrote the check right there in her seat. Her hand was steady. Her heart was going fast, but her hand was steady. She drove home that afternoon with the deed in the glove compartment. The house was quiet when she walked in. It had been quiet for 18 months, ever since Russell died. She still kept his reading glasses on the kitchen counter. His crossword puzzle book was still on the table where he'd left it the last morning he was strong enough to come downstairs, before the stroke took him 3 days later. Eloise set the deed on the table next to the puzzle book and looked at them side by side. Then she picked up the phone and called Lorraine. Her daughter answered on the second ring. She lived in Des Moines and sold real estate, which meant she had opinions about land purchases. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" "I bought some property today," Eloise said. "Property? What kind of property?" 40 acres out past the old highway. Came up at the tax auction." There was a pause. Lorraine was good at pauses. She used them the way other people used questions. "How much?" she asked. $185. Another pause longer this time. "Mom, what is it? What's on this land? Right now, water mostly. Cattails, some brush. You bought a swamp. I bought 40 acres for $185. "Mom, there's a reason nobody else bid on it. $185 for 40 acres means the land is worthless. It means even at that price, nobody wanted it. I wanted it. Why Eloise looked at Russell's puzzle book. She thought about the filing cabinet in her office down the hall. The olive green one from 1978. The one with the maps she had copied 54 years ago, when she was 19 years old, and nobody was watching. I have my reasons, Eloise said. Mom. Lorraine's voice got tight. She had her grandmother's voice when she was worried. This is what I've been talking about. Dad's been gone 1.5 years, and you're out there alone making decisions like this, buying swampland at a government auction. It sounds like dementia buying. That's what it sounds like. The words hung there. Eloise let them hang. I'm fine, Lorraine. You're 73 years old, living alone, and you just spent money on 40 acres of mosquitoes and mud. I'm worried about you. Don't be. Can you return it? Is there a cooling off period or something? I don't want to return it. Lorraine sighed. It was the sigh she used when she knew she wasn't going to win, but wanted Eloise to know she hadn't given up. We're going to talk about this more. We can talk about it whenever you want, Eloise said. Won't change anything, but we can talk. After she hung up, she sat in the kitchen for a few minutes. The house ticked around her. The furnace, the refrigerator, the clock on the wall that Russell had bought at an antique store in Amana. Sounds that used to be background noise, but had become the only voices in the house. Sterling called 20 minutes later. Eloise's youngest was 38, lived in Omaha, and worked for a company that did something with computers that Eloise had never fully understood. Sterling was the family's comedian, the one who smoothed rough edges with jokes. Lorraine says you bought a swamp, Sterling said. Eloise could hear the grin in his voice. 40 acres. Mom, you bought a mosquito farm. Sterling laughed. 185. You couldn't even buy a decent riding mower for that. What are you gonna do with 40 acres of swamp? Work it. Work it, Mom. It's underwater. Not for long. Sterling laughed again, but softer this time. You're serious. I am. Okay, well, just be careful out there. You're not 25 anymore. I'm aware. Wesley, the middle son, sent a text. Wesley was 43, lived in Cedar Rapids, and worked as an accountant. He was careful with words the way he was careful with numbers. His message said, Mom Lorraine told me about the land. Can we talk about this when you have a minute? Eloise typed back. Nothing to talk about, but I appreciate you asking. That was the end of the conversation, at least for the moment. Eloise knew her children would circle back. They always did. Lorraine would bring spreadsheets. Sterling would bring jokes. Wesley would bring questions that sounded neutral, but were really measurements. They were good people, all three of them. They just didn't understand what she was doing, and she wasn't ready to explain it, because the truth was, Eloise hadn't bought that land on a whim. She'd been thinking about it for 54 years, ever since the day she was 19 years old and working as the first and only female clerk at the Lynn County Surveyor's Office. Eloise got up from the table and walked down the hall to her home office. It was a small room barely big enough for a desk and a filing cabinet. Russell used to call it her cave. The filing cabinet was olive green, 4 drawers, the same one she'd had since 1978. Eloise opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were 2 photocopied survey maps. The first was dated 1958. 5 years before the drainage project. It showed the 40 acres in detail. Contour lines, soil classifications, water features. A blue circle marked the limestone spring. Handwritten notes in the margin read, Soil Class 1 Glacial Loam Deposit 12 to 18 inches. Topsoil natural spring flow estimated 3 gallons per minute. The second map was dated 1964. Same 40 acres, but now the contour lines were different. The spring was gone from the map. The soil classification had been changed to wetland non-productive. A note in red ink said, Drainage reroute complete per county resolution 47-63. Eloise had copied these maps herself in 1972, when she was a 20-year-old clerk at the surveyor's office and the county was moving from paper files to a new microfiche system. Her boss, a man named Donald Barkley, told her to box up the old maps for storage. Eloise photocopied the ones that interested her before they went into the basement. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Men didn't think a girl filing papers was paying attention to what the papers said. 54 years later, those copies were the only record of what the land had been before the county flooded it. The originals were probably rotting in a basement somewhere, if they hadn't been thrown away entirely. Eloise set the maps on her desk and studied them the way she had dozens of times before. The spring location, the soil depth, the drainage routes. She'd spent 35 years reading land, and this was the clearest story any piece of ground had ever told her. The land wasn't dead. It was buried. The spring was still down there pushing water up through the limestone. The soil was still there under the muck. All someone had to do was put the drainage back the way it was supposed to be, and the land would come back. Eloise had known this in her bones since she was 7 years old. Her grandmother, Adeline, had taken her to the spring on a June afternoon in 1960. Eloise remembered it like it was yesterday. The tall grass, the clear water bubbling up through cracks in gray limestone, the cold that made her fingers ache when she reached down to touch it, her grandmother filling a mason jar and letting Eloise carry it home through the fields. Somebody flooded the prettiest 40 acres in the county, Eloise, her grandmother, had said. Somebody should bring it back someday. 3 years later, in 1963, the county rerouted a drainage channel to make way for a new stretch of highway. The water table shifted. The 40 acres flooded. The spring disappeared under 2 feet of standing water, and within a few years the land was nothing but cattails and mosquitoes. Her grandmother Adeline died that same year. Heart attack. She was 68 years old. Eloise's mother never talked about the spring after that. Maybe it hurt too much. Maybe she just didn't care the way Adeline had cared. By the time Eloise was old enough to ask questions, most of the story had already been lost. All that remained was a 7-year-old girl's memory of cold water and a grandmother's hand. But Eloise remembered. And when she started working at the surveyor's office at 19, fresh out of community college, with a certificate in cartography, she started looking for the spring on the old maps. She found it. She copied the maps. She kept them in a folder for 54 years, waiting for what she didn't know, waiting for the land to come up for sale maybe, waiting for the right time, waiting for Russell to retire so they could work it together. But Russell died before they ever got the chance. And for 18 months, Eloise sat in the quiet house and wondered if she'd waited too long. Then the tax auction notice came in the mail, Parcel 17, Section 12, Township 84 North, 40 acres. Starting bid $185. Eloise knew exactly which 40 acres it was. She didn't even have to look at the map. The morning after the auction, Eloise drove out to the land. It was early October, and the air had that clean edge that meant winter wasn't far off. She parked her truck on the gravel shoulder where the old highway met the section line and stepped out. The 40 acres stretched in front of her flat and wet. Standing water reflected the gray sky. Dead cattails leaned at angles. A heron lifted off from somewhere in the middle and flew south without a sound. From the road, it looked like exactly what her children said it was. Worthless ground. A mosquito farm. The worst 40 acres in the county. Eloise opened the tailgate of her truck and sat down to pull on her rubber boots. They were the same boots she'd worn for field surveys 30 years ago. Caked with mud from 100 different properties, she tucked her pants into the tops and started walking. The water came up to her shins. The mud underneath sucked at her boots with every step. She moved slowly, reading the ground by feel the way she'd done for 35 years. Here, the bottom was soft, silty. There it firmed up where gravel lay underneath. 20 yards in the ground rose slightly, and the water dropped to her ankles. She knew where she was going. The survey map was burned into her memory. She traced the route from the road to the spring so many times on paper that her feet knew the way even through standing water and dead brush. 50 yards from the road, she stopped. The water was shallower here, maybe 6 inches deep, and the ground underneath felt different, firmer, richer. She crouched down and pushed her hand into the muck past the layer of dead leaves and silt down to the soil beneath. She pulled up a fistful and held it in the gray morning light. The soil was black, not brown, not gray. Black like coffee grounds, like the richest garden dirt you could buy at a nursery. Glacial loam, the kind that took 10,000 years to build up. The kind that could grow anything. It had been sitting under this water for 63 years and it was still there. Still perfect. Still waiting. Eloise squeezed the soil and watched it hold its shape. She brought it to her nose and smelled earth so alive it almost hummed. "Found you," she said. The word went out across the flat water and the dead cattails and disappeared into the October silence. There was nobody around to hear it. Nobody except maybe her grandmother Adeline, if she was listening from wherever she'd gone. Eloise stood up, wiped her hand on her jeans and looked out across her 40 acres. From here, standing in the middle of it with mud on her boots and black soil under her fingernails, the land didn't look worthless at all. It looked like a promise that had been waiting 63 years to be kept. She had a shovel in the truck. She had survey maps at home. She had a body that still worked mostly even at 73. And she had something nobody else in the county had. She knew exactly what was underneath. Eloise waded back to her truck, sat on the tailgate and pulled off her boots. Her knees ached. Her lower back was stiff. The October air bit through her jacket. She looked at the fistful of black soil still sitting on the tailgate where she'd set it down, and she thought about her garden journal at home. The one she'd kept for 40 years. The one where she'd pressed flowers between the pages and written notes about what grew and what failed. and scattered throughout between the planting records and the dried petals she'd written about the spring, about the cold water, about her grandmother's hand, about the promise she'd made to herself when she was 7 years old. "I want to see it one more time before I die," she had written on one page. Just once. Eloise was 73 years old. She didn't have forever. But she had right now. And right now was gonna have to be enough. She drove home, hung her muddy boots on the porch rail, and went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened her garden journal to the page about the spring, and laid the survey maps beside it. Then she picked up a pencil and started drawing drainage lines. Eloise spent that whole evening at the kitchen table with her garden journal and the survey maps sketching drainage lines on graph paper until her pencil went dull. By midnight, she had a plan. By 6 o'clock the next morning, she was at the hardware store waiting for the doors to open. The clerk, a young woman with her hair pulled back under a ball cap, watched Eloise load a cart. 2 shovels, a pickaxe, 50 feet of 4-inch PVC pipe, a post hole digger, duct tape, work gloves, building something she asked at the register. "A garden," Eloise said. She looked at the pickaxe. "Must be some garden." "It will be." Eloise paid cash, loaded the truck, and drove out to the 40 acres. The October morning was clear and cold, and the standing water on the land had a thin skin of ice at the edges. Eloise pulled on her boots, grabbed a shovel, and walked in. The drainage plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. She needed to dig a channel along the south edge of the property about 2 feet deep and 18 inches wide, running 300 yards east to the county drainage ditch that fed into the creek. Once the channel connected, gravity would do most of the work. The water had nowhere to go right now because the 1963 reroute had cut off the natural drainage. Eloise was going to reconnect it. She started digging at 7:15 in the morning. By 9 o'clock, she had cleared about 15 feet of channel. The work was slow and heavy. The soil was waterlogged and every shovelful weighed twice what dry ground would. Her back tightened after the first hour. Her hands blistered inside the gloves by the second. She stopped to rest every 20 minutes, sitting on an overturned bucket she'd brought from home, drinking water from a thermos. By noon, she had 30 feet of channel and a body that felt every one of its 73 years. She sat on the bucket and ate the ham sandwich she'd packed, looking at the long stretch of ground still ahead of her. At this rate, it would take her 3 weeks to finish the main channel alone. And that was before the lateral channels that would drain the interior sections. She went back to digging. By the end of the first day, Eloise had cleared 45 feet. Her hands were raw even inside the gloves. Her back screamed every time she bent down. But the channel was real. It was there. Water was already starting to move through it, slow but visible. She drove home in the dark. Her body so tired she could barely grip the steering wheel. She made herself eat dinner. She made herself take a hot bath. Then she sat at the kitchen table with her maps and her pencil and adjusted tomorrow's plan. She was back at the land at 7 the next morning. On the third day, Eloise was up to her knees in the channel, shoveling mud, when she heard footsteps on the gravel shoulder behind her. She turned and saw a young man standing at the edge of the road, hands in the pockets of a canvas jacket that was too thin for October. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with a lean build and brown hair that needed cutting. He looked about mid-20s, You need a hand, the young man called out. Eloise straightened up, pressing one hand against her lower back. She studied the man the way she studied land. Boots that were worn but cared for. Calluses on the hands visible even from this distance. Eyes that were tired but steady. Depends, Eloise said. You looking for work? I'm looking for anything. What's your name, Caleb? Caleb Mercer. You from around here, grew up about 10 miles south. Been living outside town since the elevator closed. Eloise knew about the grain elevator. Cedar Hollow grain elevator. Had shut down 6 months ago, when the company consolidated operations. 40 people lost their jobs, and half of them left town looking for work elsewhere. You got experience with this kind of work? Eloise asked. I spent 4 years loading grain trucks and fixing conveyor belts. I can dig a ditch. Eloise nodded. $15 an hour cash. You show up at 7, you work till I say we're done. I'll provide the tools. Caleb didn't hesitate. I'll be here tomorrow. Be here now, Eloise said. There's an extra shovel in the truck. Caleb climbed down into the channel, and they worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon. Eloise didn't talk much. She showed Caleb the drainage plan, pointed at where the channel needed to go, and let him work. Caleb was strong and fast, and he didn't complain about the cold or the mud or the water seeping into his boots. By the end of that first day together, they had cleared twice what Eloise had managed alone in 3 days. Same time tomorrow, Caleb asked, wiping mud from his face with the back of his hand. Same time. Caleb walked back toward the road. Eloise watched him go. The young man didn't have a car. He'd been walking the county road looking for day labor when he spotted Eloise working alone in a swamp. That took either desperation or something else. Eloise figured it was both. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Eloise arrived at 6:30 to set up. Caleb showed up at 7, walking the 2 miles from his rented room on the edge of town. They dug until noon broke for lunch, dug until the lights started to fade. Eloise brought 2 thermoses now, 1 coffee and 1 water and extra sandwiches. She noticed Caleb never brought his own lunch. She didn't ask why. She just made extra. The drainage channel grew. 50 feet. 100. 200. When they connected the first section to the county ditch, the effect was almost immediate. Water began moving east through the channel, slow but steady. The standing water on the south end of the property dropped 1 inch by the next morning, and 2 inches more by the end of the week. It's working, Caleb said one morning, standing at the edge of what had been ankle-deep water and was now exposed mud. It'll work faster once we get the laterals in, Eloise said. Water's been sitting here 63 years. It's not gonna leave all at once, but it'll leave. She taught Caleb to read the contour of the land, to see where water wanted to go, and where it was being held against its will. Caleb picked it up quickly. He had good instincts for terrain, and he asked smart questions. How do you know all this? Caleb asked one afternoon while they were setting PVC pipe for a lateral drain. Spent 35 years reading land for the county, Eloise said. Every time you survey a property, you learn something about how water and soil and rock talk to each other. After a while, you can look at a piece of ground and tell its whole story. What's this land story? Eloise tamped down soil around the pipe joint. This land was some of the best ground in the county until the county ruined it. Natural spring, 18 inches of topsoil, grew corn and hay for 100 years. Then somebody in the courthouse decided to reroute a drainage channel for a highway project, and the water backed up and drowned everything. And nobody fixed it. Nobody remembered there was anything to fix. 63 years is a long time. The farmers who worked this ground are all gone. The surveyor who mapped it before the reroute retired in 71 and died in 84. I'm the only one left who knows what the map said. Caleb looked out across the property, seeing it differently now. So you bought it because you knew I bought it, because I made a promise to myself. A long time ago, Eloise said. Caleb didn't push. He just nodded and went back to work. By the third week, the main drainage channel was complete, and 2 lateral branches were pulling water off the interior. The land was transforming. Mud replaced standing water. Then the mud dried and cracked in the October sun, revealing black soil underneath. The cattails that had thrived in standing water began to brown and droop as their roots lost moisture. New ground appeared every day. One afternoon, Harlan Muller's truck pulled up on the road. Harlan was a neighbor farmer, mid-70s, built like a fence post. He'd known Eloise and Russell for 40 years. He'd been a pallbearer at Russell's funeral. Harlan climbed out of his truck and walked to the edge of the property, his boots squelching in the soft ground. He stood there for a minute looking at the drainage channels, the exposed black soil, the water moving steadily toward the county ditch. Eloise Whitaker, Harlan said slowly, "What in the hell have you done out here?" "Come see," Eloise said. She led him along the main channel, showing him the lateral drains, the soil exposure, the grade she'd calculated to keep the water moving. Harlan didn't say much. He just walked and looked and occasionally crouched down to pick up a handful of soil. When they got back to the road, Harlan shook his head. "Eloise, this soil, this is better than anything on my place. Better than anything in the township." "Glacial loam," Eloise said. 12 to 18 inches deep and preserved underwater for 63 years. And you paid $185 for this. Nobody else knew what was under the water. But I did. I filed the old survey maps back in 72. They were the only record. Everybody else who worked those maps is dead." Harlan laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and surprised. "Eloise, you sly woman. You bought the best 40 acres in the county for less than the price of a decent dinner." "Don't tell anyone yet," Eloise said. "I'm not done." "What else you planning?" Eloise looked out at the drying ground. "There's a spring out there. Natural limestone spring. Been under the water since 63. I'm gonna find it." Harlan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You need help, you call me. I've got equipment. I've got time. I appreciate that." Russell would have loved this. Harlan said quietly, "You know that, right? I know." After Harlan left, Eloise stood by her truck and looked at the 40 acres. The transformation was already visible. What had been a worthless swamp 3 weeks ago was now drying ground with good soil showing through. In another week, maybe 2, the water level would drop enough to expose the area where the spring was supposed to be. If it was still there. If 63 years of standing water hadn't choked it off or rerouted it underground to somewhere else, Eloise had faith it was still there. Water didn't just disappear. It went somewhere. And if the spring had been flowing for hundreds, maybe thousands of years before 1963, it was still flowing now. She just had to find it. Lorraine called that Friday. Her voice had that tight, controlled quality that meant she'd been rehearsing what she was gonna say. "Mom, I've been thinking about the land." "Okay, I want to come down this weekend. I think we need to have a real conversation about this. About your finances. About your health. About what makes sense going forward. Come if you want," Eloise said. "But I'll be at the land most of the day." "Mom, that's what worries me. You're 73 years old digging ditches in a swamp. It's not a swamp anymore. What the water's draining. I've been working on it for 3 weeks. Most of the standing water is gone." Silence on the line. Eloise waited. "You drained a swamp," Lorraine said flatly. "I redirected the water table to its original drainage pattern. The county rerouted it in '63. I put it back." More silence. "Then I'm coming down Saturday. I'll leave the porch light on." Eloise hung up and looked at Caleb, who was standing by the truck, pretending not to listen. "Your daughter," Caleb asked. "She thinks I've lost my mind." "Have you?" Eloise smiled. It was the first real smile Caleb had seen from her. Not yet. They went back to work. The afternoon was warm for late October, and they stripped down to their shirts as they cleared brush from around the area where Eloise believed the spring was located. Caleb worked a chainsaw through dead saplings, while Eloise raked debris and piled it for burning. Around 4 o'clock, they stopped for water. Caleb sat on the tailgate of Eloise's truck, and Eloise leaned against the side. The sun was getting low and the light turned everything amber. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said. "Go ahead. Why'd you really buy this land? I know you said you made a promise, but what kind of promise?" Eloise was quiet for a moment. "When I was 7 years old, my grandmother brought me out here. This was 1960, before the highway project. The land was dry then. Good pasture. And right in the middle of it was a spring. Cold water coming up through limestone. My grandmother filled a jar and we carried it home through the fields. She told me it was the prettiest 40 acres in the county. 3 years later, the county flooded it, and my grandmother died the same year. I promised myself I'd see that spring again before I died." Caleb looked at her. "That's a long time to keep a promise." 54 years since I copied those maps," Eloise said. 66 years since I first saw the spring. Some promises take a lifetime to keep." They sat there for a while, watching the sun drop toward the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called and another answered. "You're not digging this alone anymore," Caleb said. "Whatever it takes. I'm here." Eloise nodded. She didn't say thank you. She could tell Caleb was the kind of person who felt gratitude was cheapened by saying it out loud. He'd show it instead by showing up at 7 every morning and working until the light failed. They went back to clearing brush. Saturday morning came cold and bright. Eloise was at the land by 6, checking the drainage channels and walking the area where she believed the spring was located. The ground here was firmer now. The water had dropped enough that she could walk without sinking more than an inch or two into mud. Caleb arrived at 7, and they started working the eastern section, digging shallow trenches to encourage water to flow toward the main channel. It was detail work, slow and methodical, but it was working. Every trench they dug pulled more water off the interior ground. Around 10 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled up on the road. Eloise knew that car. Lorraine. Her daughter got out and stood by the road looking out at the 40 acres. She was dressed like she was going to an office. Slacks, a blazer, heels that were already sinking into the soft shoulder. Eloise walked over. Lorraine's face was carefully neutral, the expression she used when she was trying not to judge, but absolutely was. "Hi, Mom." Lorraine. Lorraine looked past her at the exposed ground, the drainage channels, the piles of cleared brush. "This is what you've been doing. This is it. You drained it. I redirected the water to where it's supposed to go." Lorraine walked carefully along the edge of the property, her heels picking up mud with every step. Caleb had stopped working and was standing by the truck, giving them space. "Who's that?" Lorraine asked. "Caleb Mercer. He's been helping me. You hired someone $15 an hour. He's a good worker." Lorraine looked at the channels, the cleared ground, the transformation that had happened in 3 weeks. Her expression was changing. The careful neutrality was cracking. "Mom," she said quietly, "this is real. I told you it was. I thought you were confused. I thought this was some kind of grief thing. I brought papers." "What kind of papers?" Lorraine opened her bag and pulled out a folder. "Guardianship documents, financial power of attorney, information about assisted living facilities in Des Moines." Eloise looked at the folder, then at her daughter. "You were going to have me declared incompetent." Lorraine's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, Mom. You're 73. You live alone. You bought a swamp. I didn't know what else to do. You could have trusted me. I didn't understand what you were doing." Eloise took the folder from Lorraine's hands and walked over to one of the cleared areas. She crouched down and scooped up a handful of the black soil. Then she walked back and held it out to Lorraine. "Feel this," Eloise said. Lorraine hesitated, then touched the soil. It was fine and rich and dark. "This is glacial loam," Eloise said. 12 to 18 inches deep. Best soil in the county. It's been underwater for 63 years, and it's still perfect. Nobody knew it was here except me. I spent 35 years reading land for Lynn County. I know what I'm doing." Lorraine looked at her mother. Really looked at her. Maybe for the first time in years. "Mom, I didn't know you were this. This what? This smart. This capable. I've been treating you like you're fragile." "I am fragile," Eloise said. "I'm 73 years old, and I miss your father every single day. But fragile doesn't mean incompetent. And it doesn't mean I've stopped knowing who I am." Lorraine wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Eloise put her arm around her daughter. "I know you were trying to help, but I don't need saving. I need you to trust me." "Can I stay?" Lorraine asked. "Can I help? You'll ruin those shoes." "I don't care about the shoes." They worked together for the rest of the morning. Lorraine changed into spare boots. Eloise kept in the truck and spent 2 hours learning to rake cleared brush and pile it for burning. She didn't complain. She didn't check her phone. She just worked. At lunch, they sat on the tailgate eating sandwiches, and Eloise told her daughter the whole story. The spring, her grandmother Adeline, the maps she'd copied in 1972, the promise she'd made to herself when she was 7 years old. Lorraine listened without interrupting. When Eloise finished, Lorraine was quiet for a long time. "I never knew any of this," Lorraine said finally. "About Grandma Adeline, about the spring. You never told us." "It was my story to keep," Eloise said. "Until now." Lorraine looked out at the 40 acres, seeing it differently now. "What's next?" "We find the spring." By the 4th week, the main drainage channel had done its work. The standing water that had covered the 40 acres for 63 years was mostly gone, leaving behind exposed ground that cracked and hardened in the November air. What had been a swamp was now a field of drying mud scattered with the brown skeletons of dead cattails. Eloise walked the property every morning before Caleb arrived, reading the topography the way other people read newspapers. Here, the ground was higher there. It dipped into a shallow depression. The contour lines from the 1958 survey map were coming back into focus, revealing themselves through the drying earth, like a photograph developing in a chemical bath. She was looking for the spring. According to the old map, it should be located in a natural depression about 50 yards northeast of the main channel, where the limestone bedrock came closest to the surface. The map showed it as a blue circle with handwritten notes: "Natural artesian spring cold water, continuous flow." But 63 years was a long time. Springs could shift underground. They could find new outlets. They could be choked off entirely by silt and pressure changes. Eloise knew the spring might not be there anymore, and if it was, it might not be where the map said it should be. She walked the northeast quadrant, slowly watching the ground, looking for any sign. A patch of different colored soil, a slight depression where water might have pooled before evaporating, vegetation that looked healthier or different from the surrounding dead cattails. Nothing. She walked it again this time with the survey map in her hand, trying to translate the blue circle and the contour lines into the actual ground beneath her boots. The map showed the spring at a specific elevation in a specific relationship to other features. A small rise to the west, a natural drainage path to the south. Both of those features should still be there, buried under the years, but not gone. She found the rise, a gentle swell in the ground barely noticeable, but there if you knew what to look for. She found the drainage path, a slight depression that ran south toward where the main channel now flowed. The spring should be between them, right here. Eloise crouched down and pushed her hand into the mud. It was wet, but that didn't mean anything. Everything was wet. She dug deeper past the top layer of silt and organic matter down to the soil beneath. Her fingers hit something solid. Rock. She cleared away more mud and exposed a flat surface of gray limestone, streaked with mineral deposits. Her heart started beating faster. Limestone. Right where the map said it should be. She cleared more mud, working carefully, brushing away the silt with her hands. The limestone surface widened. She could see cracks in the rock, natural fissures running in different directions. She put her hand over one of the cracks and held still. There, the faintest movement of air. Cool air rising up through the crack. And then she felt it. Water. Cold water barely seeping up through the crack, not flowing yet, but there. alive, waiting. Eloise sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd found. It wasn't the bubbling spring of her memory, not yet, but it was there. Under the mud and the silt and the 63 years of neglect, the spring was still there. She heard footsteps behind her. Caleb arriving for the day. Find something, he asked. Come look. Caleb crouched beside her, and Eloise showed him the limestone, the cracks, the faint seep of water. That's it, he asked. That's it. It's choked with silt right now. We need to clear the cracks. Let the water find its way up. It'll take time, but it'll come back. They spent the next 3 days working the area around the spring. Carefully, slowly, clearing away decades of accumulated mud and silt and organic matter. Eloise brought tools from home, small trowels, brushes, a bucket for carrying away the debris. They worked like archaeologists, peeling back layers of time. Beneath the silt was a layer of clay. Beneath the clay was sand. And beneath the sand was the original topsoil, black and rich and frozen in time. The limestone shelf widened as they cleared around it. It was roughly circular, maybe 6 feet across, with multiple cracks and fissures where water had once flowed freely. Now those cracks were packed with silt that had settled in over the years. Eloise used a thin rod to probe the cracks, feeling how deep they went. Some were shallow, only a few inches. But others went down deep, farther than the rod could reach. Those were the ones that mattered. Those were the arteries connecting to the aquifer below. On the 4th day, something changed. Eloise was clearing silt from one of the deeper cracks when she felt the water pressure increase. Not much, just a slight push against her hand. But it was there. She cleared more silt. The pressure increased again, and then suddenly, water began bubbling up through the crack. Not a trickle, a real flow, cold and clear and steady. Caleb Eloise said quietly, "Look." He came over and they both watched as the water found its way up through the limestone, pooling in the depression they'd cleared, then spilling over and running south along the natural drainage path toward the main channel. The spring was coming back. Over the next 2 days, as they cleared more cracks and removed more silt, the flow increased. Water began bubbling up through multiple fissures, all of them feeding into the central pool. The pool deepened. The overflow increased. The spring was finding its rhythm again after 63 years of being buried. By the end of the week, it was unmistakable. A natural limestone spring roughly 6 feet across with clear, cold water bubbling up from deep underground and flowing steadily south. The water was so clear you could see every detail of the limestone beneath it. So cold it hurt to keep your hand in it for more than a few seconds. Eloise knelt beside the spring and cupped her hands in the water. She brought them to her lips and drank. The water tasted clean and mineral and old, like it had been waiting underground for 63 years, patient and unchanged, and was just now coming back to the surface because someone had finally given it a path. She sat down on a flat stone at the edge of the spring and stayed there for a long time, just looking at it, listening to the sound of water moving over limestone, remembering her grandmother's hand, remembering being 7 years old and thinking this was the most beautiful place in the world. "You okay?" Caleb asked quietly. "I kept my promise," Eloise said. "That's all. I just kept my promise." That evening, Eloise sat at her kitchen table with her garden journal open in front of her. She turned to a page near the middle where she'd written about the spring in her careful handwriting. Pressed between the pages was a dried aster, purple faded to brown, its petals thin and fragile. She didn't know when she'd put it there, but she was careful not to let it fall. "Found your spring, Grandma," she said to the empty kitchen. "Water's still cold, just like you said." The house was quiet. The clock ticked. The furnace hummed. And for the first time in 18 months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like someone was listening. The next morning, Eloise was back at the land when a black Cadillac pulled up on the gravel shoulder. A man in his late 50s got out wearing dress shoes that were completely wrong for the terrain. He picked his way carefully to the edge of the property. "Eloise Whitaker," he called out. "That's me, Roland Ashcroft." He extended a hand. She didn't shake it. "Real estate development. Cedar Rapids. I've been reading about your project in the county paper. Very impressive work. Thank you. I'd like to make you an offer on this property. Fair market value. Cash. You could close within 30 days. It's not for sale." "Mrs. Whitaker, I don't think you understand the opportunity here. This land has real potential now that you've drained it. I'm prepared to offer you $85,000. That's more than 400 times what you paid for it." "I know the math," Eloise said. "And I know what the land is worth. It's not for sale." Roland smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm trying to do this the easy way. You're 73 years old. You live alone. This is a lot of land to manage. A lot of maintenance. A lot of liability. What happens when you can't do the work anymore? What happens if you get hurt out here and nobody finds you for days? I'll manage. Will you?" He looked past her at the spring, at the cleared ground, at the drainage channels. "Because from what I can see, you've done some excellent restoration work here. But restoration work requires permits, environmental review, county approval. Did you file for any of that?" Eloise felt her stomach tighten. "I redirected water to its original drainage pattern. That doesn't require a permit. Are you sure about that?" "Because I've got a lawyer who specializes in county drainage law, and he seems to think your main channel crosses the county right of way. That's public land, Mrs. Whitaker. You can't alter county drainage infrastructure without authorization. That's a violation of County Code 47-12. You're bluffing." "Am I?" Roland reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "This is a notice of intent to file a complaint with the county board. Unless we can come to an agreement, I'll file this next week. The county will investigate. They'll probably issue a stop work order while they sort it out. Maybe they'll fine you. Maybe they'll make you fill in all your channels and restore the property to its original condition, which was a swamp, as I recall." Eloise looked at the document. Her hands wanted to shake, but she didn't let them. "Get off my property. Think about my offer, Mrs. Whitaker. $85,000. Cash. You could buy a nice condo in town. Somewhere. With no maintenance. No liability. No county code violations. He walked back to his Cadillac and drove away, leaving tire tracks in the soft shoulder. Eloise stood there for a long time after he left, holding the notice of intent. Her mind was racing. County Code 47-12. She didn't know if that was real or if Roland was making it up. She didn't know if her main channel actually crossed the county right-of-way or if it ran entirely on her property. She needed to check the survey, the property boundaries, the county drainage easements. She needed help. That evening, Eloise called Lorraine. Her daughter answered on the first ring. "Mom, everything okay? I need your help. Legal help. Someone's trying to force me off the land." Eloise told her daughter everything. Roland Ashcroft, the $85,000 offer, the notice of intent to file a complaint, the threat of county code violations. Lorraine was quiet for a moment after Eloise finished. Then she said, "Don't worry, Mom. I know some people. Let me make some calls." 2 days later, Lorraine showed up at the land with a man in his early 40s carrying a leather briefcase. She introduced him as Marcus Chen, a real estate attorney from Des Moines. Actually, Eloise said, looking at Lorraine, "Could we find someone else? I'd prefer to work with a different attorney." Lorraine looked confused but nodded. "Okay, let me see who else is available." She made another call. An hour later, a different attorney arrived. Patricia Brennan, late 50s, sensible shoes, the kind of person who looked like she spent her weekends hiking. She examined the notice of intent, walked the property boundaries with a GPS unit, and spent an hour comparing Eloise's survey map with the county drainage maps she'd brought with her. When she finished, she smiled. "He's got nothing. Your main channel runs entirely on your property. It connects to the county ditch at the property line, which is exactly where it's supposed to connect. You didn't alter county infrastructure. You restored natural drainage that existed before the county rerouted it. And Mrs. Whitaker, there's no County Code 47-12. He made it up. So he was bluffing. He was bluffing. But here's what I recommend. File a formal complaint with the county showing what you did and why. Get ahead of this. If he files his complaint, you want the county to already have your side of the story. Can you help me with that? That's why I'm here." Over the next week, Patricia filed a detailed report with the Lynn County Board of Supervisors, documenting the 1963 drainage reroute, the flooding of the 40 acres, and Eloise's restoration of the original drainage pattern, using the 1958 survey map as a guide. She included photographs, expert testimony from a hydrologist, and a supporting statement from Harlan Mueller, describing the soil quality that had been preserved under the water. The county board reviewed the complaint. Then they sent an inspector to walk the property and verify Patricia's claims. The inspector spent 3 hours measuring, photographing, and taking notes. When he finished, he shook Eloise's hand and said, "Ma'am, what you did here is remarkable. I wish more people understood drainage the way you do." Roland Ashcroft never filed his complaint. He didn't call again. He didn't send any more notices. He just disappeared. But one evening, about 2 weeks later, Eloise found a business card tucked under her windshield wiper. On the back, someone had written in pen, "You got lucky this time." Eloise threw the card away and went back to work. The land continued to transform. With the main drainage complete and the spring flowing freely, new ground appeared every day. The black glacial loam that had been buried for 63 years was now exposed across nearly 30 acres. Eloise and Caleb began clearing the dead cattails, pulling them up by the roots and piling them for burning. It was hard work. The cattails had been growing for decades and their root systems were deep and tangled. But beneath the roots, the soil was perfect, rich and dark and ready to grow anything. One afternoon in late November, Eloise was pulling cattails near the eastern boundary when Caleb's shovel hit something that wasn't root or soil, something solid that made a dull metallic sound. "Rock?" Eloise asked. Caleb scraped away more mud with the edge of his shovel. Not rock. The surface was too flat, too regular. He cleared a wider area. The surface was stone, but not natural stone. Cut stone. Limestone blocks, each about 8 inches wide, laid in a straight line with mortar between them. Mrs. Whitaker Caleb said quietly, "Come look at this." Eloise came over and crouched down. She ran her hand along the stones. They were hand-cut, fitted together with lime mortar that was old and crumbling at the edges but still holding. Someone had built this. Built it well. Built it to last. "Keep going," Eloise said. "Careful now. Brush it clean. Don't dig into it." Caleb worked the shovel, gently peeling back layers of mud and silt. More wall appeared. A corner. A second wall running perpendicular to the first. A structure. Something had been built here right next to the spring and had been buried under water and mud for over 60 years. Eloise stood up slowly. Her pulse was steady in her ears. She looked at the emerging stone walls and then at the spring, and she knew exactly what this was. "A spring house," she said. "What's that?" People used to build them over natural springs, before refrigeration. The cold water kept food fresh. Milk, butter, meat. A spring like this one with water this cold, it would have been valuable, worth protecting. Worth building something permanent around. They spent the rest of that day clearing mud from the stone walls. Not with shovels anymore, but with hand trowels and soft brushes, the way Eloise had seen archaeologists work on television. Whatever was under here had been buried for over 60 years, and she wasn't going to damage it with careless digging. By the end of the day, they had exposed 2 walls meeting at a right angle. The structure had been roughly 20 feet by 15 feet, built from hand-cut limestone blocks, fitted together with lime mortar. The craftsmanship was solid. Someone who knew stonework had built this. The walls stood about 2 feet high, which meant the rest had either collapsed or been scavenged for building material long before the land flooded. The next morning, they continued clearing. Eloise worked along the east wall where it met the natural limestone shelf of the spring. Caleb worked the south wall, brushing away decades of accumulated silt. Around 10 o'clock, Eloise's trowel scraped something different. A stone larger than the others set deeper into the foundation at the southeast corner. A cornerstone. She cleaned the surface carefully, brushing away loose dirt and blowing away the dust. The stone was about 12 inches square, and it was carved. Cut into its face, still legible after more than a century, were 2 lines. The first was a date, 1887. The second was a pair of initials. C.H. Eloise sat back on her heels and stared at the carved letters. Her hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. C.H. 1887. Caleb came over and read over her shoulder. "You know who that is," Eloise knew. She knew the way you know something you've been circling for years without realizing it. Her grandmother's stories, the spring, the family that had been here before anyone else. Her grandmother's maiden name was Hartwell. Before she married and became Adeline Pierce, she was Adeline Hartwell. "I need to go into town," Eloise said. "Keep clearing the walls. Be careful with the cornerstone area." She drove to the county library with mud still on her boots and asked the librarian where the Historical Society records were kept. The librarian pointed her to a door at the end of the hallway. "Basement. It's not much, but everything from before 1900 is down there." The Historical Society was one room with fluorescent lights and metal shelving. Property records, tax rolls, church registers, cemetery logs. Eloise found the property transfer books for the 1880s and ran her finger down the pages until she found it. Section 12, Township 84, North 40 acres. Purchased from the federal government by Clara Hartwell. March 15, 1886. Purchase price $1.25 per acre. Clara Hartwell. Eloise pulled down the next volume. Tax records showed Clara paying taxes on the property from 1886 through 1902. After that, the land transferred to Frederick Hartwell, who Eloise guessed was Clara's husband. Frederick paid taxes until 1928, when the land was sold to a farmer named Dietrich, who held it until the county flooded it in 1963. Clara Hartwell had been Eloise's great-grandmother. Her grandmother Adeline had been Clara's daughter. Adeline was the one who took Eloise to the spring when she was 7 years old. Adeline was the one who told the stories about cold water and mason jars and walking through the tall grass. But Eloise had never known that Clara built the spring house. She'd never known her own family had owned that land. The stories had gotten thinner with each generation the way stories do. By the time they reached Eloise, all that was left was the spring itself and the memory of cold water. And now here it was, Clara Hartwell, the stone walls, the cornerstone with her initials. All of it had been underwater for Eloise's entire life. Eloise closed the record book and sat in the basement of the county library for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed above her. A water pipe ticked in the wall. 4 generations of women. Clara Adeline Eloise's mother, who died when Eloise was 12, and Eloise herself. All connected to this land. All connected to this spring. And Eloise was the one who brought it back. She drove back to the land. She parked on the shoulder and sat in her truck for another 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, looking out at the 40 acres where Caleb was still working. When she finally got out, Caleb looked up from the south wall. "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost." Something like that. Eloise sat down on the cornerstone and told Caleb the whole story. Her grandmother Adeline, the spring, the stories that had been passed down through 4 generations of women. Clara Hartwell, 1887. The land that Eloise's family had built on, lived on, and lost all before Eloise was born. Caleb listened without interrupting. When Eloise finished, he was quiet for a while. "She never knew," Caleb said. "Your grandmother never knew her own mother built this. My grandmother was born in 1885. She was 2 years old when Clara built the spring house. She probably didn't remember. And by the time Grandma Adeline was old enough to ask questions, Clara might have been gone. The stories got lost, but you found them again. I found the spring. I found the walls. I found Clara's cornerstone. That's more than I ever expected to find." They went back to work. Eloise was quieter than usual, and Caleb gave her space. The afternoon sun warmed the stone walls, and the spring caught the light and scattered it across the limestone. They worked along the north wall where the foundation was most intact. The wall was thicker here, almost 2 feet wide, and it formed a small alcove where the spring entered the structure. It was designed so the water would flow through the building and out the other side, keeping the interior cold even in summer. Caleb was clearing debris from the alcove when his trowel clinked against something. "Metal," he said, brushing more dirt away. It wasn't metal. It was glass. The lip of a glass jar sealed with a flat stone and what looked like old wax or pitch. The jar was sitting in a niche in the wall, a deliberate recess in the stonework about 6 inches deep and 8 inches wide. Someone had built this niche on purpose. Someone had placed the jar here and sealed it in. "Mrs. Whitaker," Caleb said, "you need to see this." Eloise came over and crouched beside him. Caleb had exposed the jar fully now. It was a mason jar, the old kind with a zinc lid and a rubber gasket. The glass was cloudy but unbroken. Inside, Eloise could see paper. Folded paper, yellowed but dry. She reached into the niche and pulled the jar out carefully. It was heavy. The seal was intact. Whatever was inside had been protected from water and air for a very long time. Eloise held the jar up to the light and turned it slowly. The paper inside was folded into thirds, with writing visible on the outermost fold. Old handwriting, small and careful. She sat down on the foundation wall and set the jar on her knee. Her hands were steady, but something inside her chest was not. "Open it," Caleb said. Eloise worked the zinc lid. It was corroded and stiff, but it gave after a few turns. The rubber gasket crumbled when the seal broke. A faint smell of old paper and mineral air came out. She reached inside and pulled out the folded paper. It was thicker than she expected. Good quality paper, the kind that lasted. She unfolded it carefully, aware that it could tear at the creases. The letter was written in ink that had faded from black to brown. The handwriting was small, precise, and feminine. At the top, a date, September the 14th, 1887. Eloise read it aloud, her voice low and steady. "To whoever finds this place again. My name is Clara Hartwell. I built this spring house with my husband Frederick and our neighbor James Dietrich in the summer of 1887. We built it over the spring because the spring belongs to everyone and we wanted to make sure it stayed that way." Eloise's voice caught on the next line. She cleared her throat and kept going. "The water is clean and cold and has never stopped flowing in the 14 years since we settled this land. Our children drink from it. Our neighbors fill their jugs here every Saturday. In winter, the spring never freezes, and in summer, it keeps our milk and butter fresh when the heat would spoil them." She turned the letter over. The writing continued on the back. "I do not know who will read this or when. Perhaps no one ever will. And this letter will sit in its jar until the stones crumble around it. But if you are reading this, then you found the spring, and that means something brought you here for a reason. This land has been good to us. I hope it will be good to whoever comes after." Eloise stopped. Her hand was shaking now. She folded the letter along its original creases and held it against her chest. Caleb didn't say anything. He just stood there, hands at his sides, watching Eloise hold the letter written by a woman who had been dead for more than 100 years. A woman whose great-granddaughter had spent her whole life dreaming about this exact spot without ever knowing the full story. After a few minutes, Eloise put the letter back in the jar and screwed the lid on loosely. She set the jar on the cornerstone next to the carved initials of the woman who had written it. "My grandmother would have loved this," Eloise said. Her voice was rough. She spent 50 years talking about this spring. 50 years. And she never knew her own mother built the walls around it. She never knew Clara wrote a letter and sealed it in the stone. Eloise looked at the spring, at the water still coming up through the limestone, steady and cold and ancient. "I bought this land because I made a promise to myself when I was 7 years old. I thought I was doing it for my grandmother's memory. But my family was here first. They built this. They put the letter in the wall for someone to find. And somehow, 137 years later, it was me." She stood up slowly. Too slowly. The world tilted for a moment, and she put her hand on the wall to steady herself. The ground seemed to shift under her feet, and her vision went gray at the edges. "Mrs. Whitaker." Caleb grabbed her arm. "Hey, sit down." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You went white. Sit down." Eloise sat. Caleb put a hand on her shoulder and kept it there until the color came back to her face. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked. "Breakfast." "It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon." I got distracted. Caleb went to the truck and came back with a water bottle and the last of the granola bars from the glove box. Eloise drank and ate and felt the world settle back into place. The dizziness passed, but the weakness lingered. "You need to take it easier," Caleb said. "I need to finish what I started." "You will, but not if you drop dead out here because you forgot to eat lunch." Eloise looked at him. The young man's expression was direct and worried. It reminded her of Sterling, her youngest, when Sterling was still a boy and hadn't learned to hide concern behind jokes. "Deal," Eloise said. "I'll eat lunch. You remind me. I'll remind you." They packed up early that day. Caleb drove Eloise's truck back to the house while Eloise sat in the passenger seat with Clara's letter in her lap. She didn't want to let go of it. At the house, Caleb helped her inside and made sure she had dinner in the refrigerator. Then he walked back toward town the way he always did. Eloise watched him from the kitchen window until he was out of sight. Then she sat down at the table. She set Clara's letter on the left side. She opened her garden journal to the page about the spring and set it on the right. 2 women a century apart, both in love with the same piece of ground, both writing about the same cold water, the same limestone, the same hope that someone would take care of it. Eloise had written the spring. "I want to see it one more time before I die." Clara had written, "This land has been good to us. I hope it will be good to whoever comes after." Eloise sat between them in the kitchen of the house where she'd lived for 47 years and felt the weight of what she'd found. The weight of connection across time. The weight of promises that outlast the people who make them. She touched her garden journal with one hand and Clara's jar with the other. "Your mother built it, Grandma," she said to the empty room. She built the walls around the spring and put a letter in the stone. She hoped someone would find it. The clock ticked. The furnace hummed. And I'm going to build it back.